Well, thanks everybody for coming today. I'm Tim Bowery, President of Bethel Park Historical Society. So on behalf of the Historical Society, we welcome you to the Schoolhouse Arts and History Center. We began our lecture series well over a year ago, and one of the things we want to do, as well as preserve the building and the history of the candidate, is also return the building to its roots as an educational facility. So hence we are here today. Our speaker today is longtime Bethel Park resident Dick Jewell. He has had a varied career, a U.S. Army veteran, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Division. He is a lawyer with extensive trial and corporate experience. He has also been a partner, vice president, and director in 3 of our nation's largest forensic accounting consulting firms. He has had 2 segues into higher education. First, in 1988 through 91, he was a University Trust officer in charge of Pitt's 5 applied research companies and was president of the Pittsburgh Applied Research Corporation, which operated the world-class research and development facility owned and developed by Gulf Oil, which was gifted to Pitt in 1986 by Chevron. From 2003 to 2014, he was president of Rose City College, his undergraduate alma mater. He's also served 2 times from 2015 to 2019 as commissioner of the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board. Trained in history and law, he has over the years been a frequent lecturer on topics related to American history and the American experience. He has presented over 10 different lectures, some many times, most recently presented here at the Schoolhouse Arts and History Center on the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. Today he's here to speak on Eisenhower Soldier Statesman. So on behalf of the Schoolhouse and the Historical Society, welcome Mr. Jewell again today.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Well, Tim, thank you very much, and it's great to see everybody. And when I say see everybody, I have a lady from the first law firm I joined, Mary Lou Jacobs, who then was the secretary, went on to become a lawyer in her own right. We haven't seen each other in 40 years, and we recognize each other right away. That's a good sign, by the way, after 40 years. It's also great to see everybody and to be part of this lecture series. And I was talking with Tim just before we got started about his development of this lecture series, and more folks coming, maybe doing four times a year or so, and really making this a regularly scheduled event and opportunity for the residents of Bethel Park and beyond. As Tim said, I really, for years, have been doing a lot of lectures on historical topics. A year and a half ago, I was invited to speak to the annual fall convention of the Daughters of the American Revolution. There were 88 women and myself. It was one of my wife came with me, and it was one of the more interesting. I talked about the Constitutional Convention, but I often talk about the founders and the framers. The Kennedy assassination was something I'd sort of followed all my life, and when I did it on the 60th anniversary, I realized there weren't many people still talking about that assassination, because it was picked up, it was covered by Tribune Review, picked up by newspapers, on our local TV, and it turned out it went viral all over the state, around the country. I got calls from radio stations, including the largest one in Detroit, Michigan, to do a drive segment on the Kennedy assassination, which I did. I don't expect that same coverage for this one, I might add. But Dwight Eisenhower is a fascinating gentleman. Jack Kennedy, in his inaugural address, indicated the very first part of that address that the torch had been passed to a new generation born in this century, meaning the 1900s. Ike's born in 1890. Tempered by a long and steely peace, that was the Cold War, and of course involved in 2 major world wars. Those 2 world wars and the Cold War were really the life of Dwight Eisenhower. As a young officer in World War I, graduating from West Point in 1915. By the way, in 1915, 59 graduates of that class became generals. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 5-stars. Omar Bradley was in his class, and of course, Mr. Eisenhower. And then 2, 3, 4-stars, a number of 3-stars, and a whole bunch of 1-stars. When one of his classmates during the middle of the war became a 1-star general, somebody came in to tell him, and he smacked his head and started laughing. He said, "That fellow always tried to follow every rule in the book at the academy. I'm shocked he made it to general." And I'll talk a little bit more about Eisenhower at West Point and how he was a very good student. He finished in the top half of his class. He was an outstanding mathematician. And one of the other lectures that I do is on Ulysses S. Grant. And there is an amazing, you're going to see it, I'm going to draw some parallels between Mr. Grant 80 years before, who came of age, obviously, and became of public knowledge in the Civil War, and Mr. Eisenhower, who became internationally world famous as a result of his generalship and guidance of the Allied forces in World War II. In fact, there's an amazing parallel, and it's a parallel of celebrity, of notoriety that attaches to folks when they get to those levels, no matter what age it has been. Mr. Eisenhower was born in 1890, and I'm going to call him Ike. He preferred Ike. Actually, he was Ike from the time he was a little boy. His brother Edgar, he had 5 other brothers. His brother Edgar, who was just a little bit older than him, was called Big Ike, and he was called Little Ike. So I'll refer to him as Ike. And I also should add that when he left office as the 39th President of the United States, he wrote to all his close friends. We'll talk about some of those close friends that he got to know. And he said, "Now, gentlemen and ladies, I am Ike to you all. Please do not call me Mr. President or General," although he actually preferred to be called General as opposed to Mr. President after he was out of office. And he even did not mind being called General when he was in office. He grew up in Abilene, Kansas, born in Denison, Texas. His father moved after Ike's first year to Abilene, Kansas, to take a job in a creamery where he worked the rest of his life. And where in a white clapboard house, the Eisenhowers raised their children, the 6 boys. The Eisenhowers were Mennonites, which were pacifists. It's kind of interesting that Richard Nixon was raised by Quakers, also pacifists. And I'll comment on that a little bit later, some of those kinds of interesting parallels. He was a wonderful athlete and a very good student in high school. He played football, he played baseball. Baseball was his life, his passion. Football he enjoyed a great deal also, and he was very good at it. He was 6'1", 170 pounds, and he was fast. He was a very fast runner. He played mostly defense in high school, and then I'll mention what he did when he got to West Point. When he was 14 years old, he suffered a cut on his leg, which became severely infected. Now, this is before there's a lot of medications that can help those kinds of things. And about a week into it, he's in bed, he can't move, his leg's just swollen up, and the doctor suggests that the leg be amputated. Ike said, no, we're gonna work this thing through if we can. And within 2 weeks, although they were ready to take the leg off, what they were doing for it took force and he healed. And so he was able to keep that leg. His best friend from high school was a fellow named Swede Hazlitt. They were just great friends. They did many things. They fished together, they hunted together. Those are the kind of things boys did when they lived in that kind of enlightened rural atmosphere. And Hazlitt became a friend of his for the rest of his life. Eisenhower, or Ike, throughout his life, even when he was as busy as president or as the supreme commander in Europe, wrote a lot of letters. And he wrote a lot of letters to Swede Hazlitt. He wrote 339 letters to his wife, Mamie. We'll talk about Mamie. But he was a great letter writer. And his word I'm trying to use here, and I've read so much about Eisenhower over the years, and now I've built a deep dive that I've just recently taken. He was a genuine, authentic person. He was kind. He listened. He was a very good listener. He didn't put on airs. He was simply a down-to-earth fella. And you'll see from all the great pictures, and Tim, thank you very, very much for putting those together. He was a very nice-looking gentleman and had that great Eisenhower smile. All the brothers had that famous smile. His mother had a great smile, and he used that smile to his great advantage. That smile very disarming because it was an act of kindness, and it would have people settle, be settled down when they were in his presence and around him. As he's finishing high school and playing a lot of baseball, he and Sweet Hazlitt decide they were going to try to go to the military academies. They each take the test. Hazlitt qualifies for the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Ike missed it by 1 point. It was a little bit higher by 1 point. Had he gotten one more point, he probably would have gone to Navy with Hazlitt, his buddy. But he didn't. He gets in and gets an appointment to West Point. And in 1911, he gets on the train, just like Grant did when he was heading to West Point back in the 1840s. First time he'd gone that far east, and he gets to West Point. But he goes, as most writers and folks that have known him from his days at the Point, he goes with an air of confidence. Not overconfidence, not supercilious confidence, not, chest-beating confidence, but confident that he knew who he was. And that he felt he had the skills, the interpersonal skills to succeed, and the intellectual skills to also do well. And that turned out to be the story, which I'll just paint for you in a second, of West Point. But I want to give you a quote. As I was looking back on his life, and this is a quote that he did in 1947, when he's world famous, obviously, and he's just finishing as the Army Chief of Staff, post-World War II, and he wants to talk about growing up in Abilene. He said, Abilene provided both a healthy outdoor existence and a need to work in these same conditions. You were responsible. We had a responsible society, which more nearly than any other I have encountered, eliminated prejudice based upon weather, wealth, race, or creed, and maintained a standard of values that placed a premium upon integrity, decency, consideration for others. Any youngster who has the opportunity to spend his early youth in an enlightened rural area has been favored by fortune. That's a wonderful quote. That quote really symbolizes, as I came to understand all the readings of various biographers of him and some of the original writings that he did and speeches as I prepared this lecture over the years, although I really worked on it in the last 3 months pretty hard. That really epitomizes Mr. Eisenhower. And that was one of the great strengths that he had. My wife and I, when I was at Grove City, became good friends with a gentleman who was a 4-star admiral and was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he reminded me of Eisenhower in many ways. He was in the bottom half of his class at Annapolis, but he had an incredible skill of talking to people and wanting to talk to people. He could talk to a sailor on the fantail of a ship for an hour about where they were each from and have a good time. He had the intellect to understand what was necessary, if you can imagine being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and being also the chief of naval operations before that. But it was that skill that really was created from almost birth. As the tree is bent, so doth the tree incline, both from the maturational process of parents and friends, colleagues, and some of the natural process, too, of genetic preparation. It creates people like that. And Mike Mullen, Admiral Mullen, who I'm talking to, remind me very much of Mr. Eisenhower. He goes to West Point. He finishes, there's 177 in his class that graduate. There's about 40 that don't graduate. West Point in those days, a little bit less today, had a few. Today there's a lot less that wash out, but they would have a high washout rate. When Ulysses Grant went to West Point, half the class was gone by the second year. So it was tough. and it was strictly monitored for academics, and if you didn't make the grade, you were done, you were gone. And so Ike finishes in the top half of his class. He's number 10 in English, and he's about number 3 in math. And he always had a mathematical mind, which in later life, and during his years in the Army, he was a great bridge player, contract bridge player, very well-known bridge player. He played it for years. He sometimes would play bridge 5 and 6 nights a week. And when he became famous, the famous professional bridge players would show up at the White House Saturday night, one of them or so, casually, or every once in a while, and get in one of the games. And they had a high degree of respect for Mr. Eisenhower as a bridge player. Now, as a golfer, he also, we heard a lot of stories about Ike's golfing. And you'll see a picture here, one of the pictures. He has a big sign that says, "Don't ask what I shot." Thanks for getting that one, Tim. He was about a 15, 16 handicapper, which is a good business golfer. He didn't lose the ball, and he could play. And he also had his own place after World War II when he became world famous. His friends were much different from his friends from his Army days. They were all millionaires and multimillionaires because everybody liked Ike, you remember that statement about him, and wanted to become his friend and to know him. And among other things, they built a beautiful cottage for him. And you'll see it this weekend because the Masters is on at Augusta, called the Eisenhower Cottage. And he spent many years at Augusta on his vacations and golfing there. And Cliff Roberts, who was the president for years of that great golf club, was his personal financial advisor. Those are just some teases about some things that came further in his life. When he graduates from West Point, he is assigned to Fort Sam Houston. And Fort Sam is located in San Antonio, Texas. And he's there about 2 months, and a young lady came to visit some friends of hers in San Antonio, whose name was Mamie Dowd. Miss Dowd was the daughter of a fairly wealthy family, as the only child, if I remember right, from Denver, Colorado. And she's introduced to Eisenhower. Within 9 months, they were married. So he proposed to Mamie within a month and a half, and with 9 months, they were married. My phone is going off. The Auditor General, Tim DeFord. All right, sorry. Thought I had that off. So he and Mamie are married, and it was very hard being in the Army as a young lieutenant and a young captain before a war, or especially between the wars. But of course, World War I is soon to start. World War I is declared by the United States in early April of 1917. Of course, it had been going on since 1914. Between 1914 and 1917, we had gotten to the stagnant lines between the Germans, Russians, and the English and French, which was a process of destroying an entire generation of the young males from those countries. Millions died, and they could not advance. It was just a stagnation. They had warfare where they'd go out, they'd get shot, they'd come back out. They made very little progress. Finally, the Russians got out of the war. They couldn't afford it, and they were having a communist revolution. First the white Russians, and then Lenin and the communists. Lenin came back and took over Russia, and they had an armistice with Germany. That armistice, the seeds of that armistice, sowed the seeds for World War II. And most knowledgeable professional military people had a feeling there was going to be another war. And most said, and I've done a lot of reading in this area, most said that it was going to be within 15 or 20 years. And of course, they were correct. Eisenhower winds up, I should say one more thing about West Point because it's relevant to what I'm going to say. He becomes the most talked about halfback in Eastern college football. Now, Eastern College football, except for Notre Dame, was where football was not the SEC back in those days. It was Eastern College football and a couple of teams out in California and Notre Dame. He injures his knee in the Tufts game, and then riding cavalry exercises at the point, had a terrible knee injury that tore ligaments and tendons just before the Navy game, and that ended Ike's football career. So they made him, one of the things that was his most innate strength, they made him the freshman coach. Eisenhower was a great coach. He was a great mentor. He was a great teacher. And all of those skills he had and brought with him to the point, relating to people, understanding what the mission was, understanding what kind of teaching methods were necessary to become successful individually so that they could accomplish that mission. All, I'm using military terms, but those terms apply to how he coached at Army and what people thought of him. So he was a great coach. World War I happens. Everybody in his class, what do you want to do? If you're a graduate of West Point, you want to go to battle. You want to go to war. He couldn't get out of the country. He was too good a teacher. And he was starting to develop, along with a fella who had graduated in 2009 named George S. Patton, Jr. How many have seen the movie Patton? The movie Patton is probably the most accurate military movie of the life of anybody ever made. It's based on the Ladislas Farragut, who was the biographer of, the first biographer and the most prolific one of Patton. And Omar Bradley was the advisor throughout the entire picture. So it's extremely, extremely accurate. And Patton, of course, thought that the history for World War II, just like Billy Mitchell thought it was the airplane in 1920 and 21, Patton thought it also would be fast-moving tanks supported by the infantry. And Eisenhower got involved in that. He wound up the latter part of World War I, and we're only in the war 18, 19 months. We're not in those 6 or 7 years. As the instructor at Camp Colt, and he's a acting brevet. He's actually a first lieutenant, but they named him a lieutenant colonel. And he's the commander of 10,000 troops in training and 600 officers at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where they are starting to develop both tactics and the skills of the combat arm called armor, using tanks and personnel carriers, etc., in the very early stages. As soon as the war is over, he is then moved to Camp Meade in Maryland. And that's where he hooks up directly with George Patton, because Patton's at Meade. Patton was the greatest horseback rider in the Army in the 1900s, just as Ulysses Grant was by far the greatest equestrian in the 1800s in the U.S. Army. Patton married a very wealthy woman from Boston and was able then to have a string of polo ponies, 20 of them, that would follow him around at all the commands that he had or where he was emplaced in the United States. And he and Eisenhower became great friends. They couldn't have been more different. And of course, there were some blow-ups, and we'll talk about that quickly, in World War II. But Patton was truly a warrior. On the 7th of December, 1941, Eisenhower's taken a nap. He's awakened and told about Pearl Harbor. He gets a telegram immediately from George Patton celebrating the fact that they were going to be in the war together that they had always talked about, and he wished Ike a glorious and bloody war. That was Patton. He never changed. So Eisenhower is at Fort Meade. And at Fort Meade over dinner, he meets General Fox Connor. Now, life is filled with mentorship. If you're in a law firm, you wind up being mentored by 1 or 2 lawyers above you. That's how it usually works. If you're in a giant corporation, you don't necessarily get lost in that corporation if you're being mentored by people on their way up who are kind of drawing you with them and on their way up. And Fox Connor was probably one of the great generals of World War I. He was a Corps deputy commander, and was thought of as a very thoughtful and brilliant guy, and a guy who wanted to mentor the best and the brightest in the military. He and Eisenhower were made for each other, he and Ike. And so within 2 years, Fox Connor is sent to be the United States commander in the where the canal is, Panama Canal, and he takes Eisenhower with him as his deputy commander. And he works with Ike for 3 years. They read Clausewitz. They look at what various generals had done in battles. And he also nominates him to the Command and General Staff School, this is Eisenhower, Ike, in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. There are 2 charm schools that you have to go through if you're going to be a general in the military. And it's more than just charm. It's hard work, and it lasts up to a year. One is the Command and General Staff. 235 students are enrolled with Ike over that year. At the end of it, and everybody's graded strictly to see where they ranked, Eisenhower's number 1. 3 years later, he was in the top of his class at the Army War College, which is still over in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So he not only is doing extremely well in those professional officer schools, but he's being mentored for 3 years by Fox Connor. And that mentorship is just extraordinary. When he's finished with Connor and the Command and General Staff School, he's assigned to another general, perhaps you've heard of, MacArthur. And MacArthur had 2 years left as Chief of Staff of the United States Army in the early 1930s. He was a brevet, in other words, he was a 2-star general in the regular Army, but when you're the commanding general and the chief general of the Army, you had four stars with you. When that ends in 1935, he gets an offer to go out to the Philippines to be the chief military advisor to the president of the Philippines. The United States had taken over the Philippines. And they were working with them to become independent, which they became in July of 1946. But they needed to have, they were a country, and they needed to have a lot of advice. And so the President Quezon brought MacArthur out. MacArthur brought Ike out as his number 2. Now, MacArthur was not necessarily a mentor. Some thought he was demented. He was a very strong egotist, but a very bright guy. And I have another quote I'd like to share with you. There was a lot of sense that Eisenhower's time with MacArthur, which was from 35 to 1939, that the 2 men did not get along. They did get along. It was Ike's job to get along with MacArthur. And he did have a lot of respect for MacArthur. What he wrote in his memoirs, Ike said this. He described MacArthur as decisive, personable in his own way, amazingly comprehensive in his knowledge, possessed of a phenomenal memory. But he was a peculiar fellow, Ike said. He had a habit of referring to himself in the third person. As to his egotism, he could never see another sun in the heavens. He did have, Ike said, a hell of an intellect. My God, but he was smart. He had a brain. It also described, many said, Eisenhower, as well as George Catlett Marshall. But MacArthur could read a speech or an intellectual military paper, put it down, and repeat it verbatim. So in his own way, while he was mentored by Fox Connor, he had as an exemplar, not being mentored, but watching carefully how MacArthur interacted diplomatically, which became very important in Eisenhower's life, with third parties and others. When MacArthur was withdrawn from the Philippine job, World War I, of course, starts on the 1st of September 1939 when the Germans invade Poland. And then there's the quiet, phony war until about 9 or 10 months later, when all hell breaks loose, is probably a good way to put it, and we start to have the beginnings of what really is a world war. Ike is transferred, again, as a lieutenant colonel, but that's not his rank is less than that. He's now a major. He was a major in the regular army for 12 years, between World War I and World War II. He didn't move very fast, and there weren't many folks in the service, because the United States had a history of having to gin up folks in a heck of a hurry, and then demilitarization in a heck of a hurry. Until the Cold War, we did not have a large standing military. That was not our history. So Eisenhower is sent to the 15th Infantry Regiment Division at Fort Lewis in the state of Washington. And that's where Dale, my wife, and I spent my last year and a half in the Army at Fort Lewis. And sure enough, on Officers Row, there's the house, a beautiful little brick, not little, pretty good sized brick house that Ike lived in. Obviously, it's a museum now because of who he was and became, and that he spent that time at Fort Lewis. He gets a call at Fort Lewis right after Pearl Harbor, and it's from the Chief of Staff to the Chief General, United States Army, George Catlett Marshall. Marshall, of course, is from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Marshall was the great architect of the United States and Allied response in World War II. And Marshall had succeeded MacArthur in 1935 as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. We don't have a Secretary of Defense. We don't have any of that stuff until 48, 49, 50. That's how it was organized in those days. And he became an absolutely incredibly important advisor to Mr. Roosevelt as we were not only gearing up for war, as we were getting ourselves into war. And gearing up took a good year and a half because we had to gear up our armaments, and we had to come to a decision about a two-front war in which we were in. Was the emphasis going to be in Europe, or was it going to be in the Pacific? And how are we going to balance those two things? How is that going to be possible? And so he gets a call from Bedell Smith, General Colonel then, Smith, and he said, Ike, General Marshall wants you in Washington as soon as you can get here. Get on the first plane. Well, the planes didn't fly in bad weather. It's in wintertime. It took him 7 days going all around the United States to finally get to Washington. He gets there on a Sunday morning and goes directly to the War Department. And the War Department was located in that old building right behind the White House. And he goes in and reports to General Marshall. Eisenhower, he said, and by the way, he called him Eisenhower the rest of Ike's life till he became president. And then it was Mr. President. Marshall was not a warm and fuzzy guy. He was not a user of first names. He goofed up one time. This is hilarious. He goofs up one time in talking about Eisenhower, calls him Ike, and stops in dead sentence after he said that, had to recover, and then goes back to Eisenhower. It just was so out of character, for him. When he reports to Marshall, Marshall gives him a thumbnail sketch of the situation, sit rep we would call it, situation report, about what's going on across the world in the first 5 days of World War II. First 4 days, because we didn't declare war till the next day. And he said to Eisenhower, what would you advise? Ike said, let me have 2 or 3 hours, and let me think about it, and I'll come back. Fine. Ike comes back, and he goes through 7 or 8 things, bing, 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 bing. Marshall said, I agree with you, Eisenhower, I agree with you. And he said, I need people, and you're going to be, and he becomes the head of war plans for the Pacific. And he said, and he's made a brigadier general. I need people who will make decisions, who will do command kinds of things without bothering me. You can tell me anytime you want afterwards. I have my trust is in you. So Eisenhower is now working 7 days a week in war plans as we're trying to get the war effort off the ground. By June of that year, 41, now we're in 42, we're already planning, and they'd had one big conference, the Arcadia Conference, where the English had come over and Churchill had come over. They had met on a ship, and Eisenhower had a tremendous ability to relate to the British, except for Montgomery. We'll talk about that fellow too. That was not a good relationship. And Alan Brooke, the chief general, both of them were very hard on Eisenhower. The balance of the British, including the prime minister, thought quite a bit of Eisenhower and his ability to get along and to explain things succinctly and with confidence, but not without overstatement. This is I've said this earlier, you have to trace the skill that Mr. Eisenhower had, that Ike had, along to see how important that it was. They decided that Ike would plan what became Operation Torch. The big discussion, even in those first weeks between the English and the Brits, was, are we going to go across the channel, and when? Well, they weren't ready for that yet, but they had to have diversionary opportunities to carry the war forward. They decided to take it to North Africa, and then into Sicily, and then up into Italy, and by that time, they were ready the next year to put everything together for Overlord, which was the invasion of Europe cross-channel. Eisenhower was named the commander of Torch. That was the invasion of North Africa. And one of his commanders of one of the armies under him, and he was with him throughout, was George Patton. Patton was a warrior, there is no doubt about it. He was a tactical genius. He was a fellow who could not be stopped, who stood out in front when the bullets were going by his nose. You remember from the movie that he took over 2nd Corps near the Kasserine Pass from General Friedendahl, and he's talking to the British, who had the air control with the British Air Force, and he's complaining about the lack of air superiority, and he's told we have air superiority when a whole bunch of strafing Germans fly over his headquarters, and Patton's out there shooting his pistol up at him while bullets are raining down. And Tedder, Air Marshal Tedder, yells, "Get back in here, George. We need a Corps commander, not a dead soldier." And that's true. All that actually happened. He came many times close to death and died. We'll talk about that after the war was over, about 6 months later, in a car accident. So Operation Torch goes through North Africa, and it takes longer. Took about 3-4 months longer, and they have lots of casualties. One of the things is, frankly, we had to get used to fighting. American and British troops had to get used to fighting. The Germans were a machine, had been for a long time, but it took the skills and the experience of troops living and dying, being heroes, being statistics, being then replaced as we brought more and more people over, to get themselves kind of into fighting shape, if you will. My time in the Army, I never fired a shot in anger, was never fired at, so I can't relate to that. But I've known enough folks who've been involved in that, and to really talk to them, they often won't talk about it. Dale's dad was, my wife's dad was machine gunned at Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge. And 4 years later, was it 1949, Dale? He had a pain in his chest, and while they had done meatball surgery on him at a MASH unit to save his life, his uniform started to come, his skin broke, and his uniform started to come out of his chest. And there is Mr. Hampy, they took a picture of him, holding up his uniform with 2 or 3 buttons that had been blown into him at the Battle of the Bulge. You can recount things like that, but unless you've been there and felt the fear and felt the trauma, you just can't replicate that. Words won't do it. But it took time. And it took time for the commanders to learn how to tactically move their armies, and to the extent they could, to integrate the British with the Americans. And there was always an underlying fight going on as to who was going to get credit, the British or the Americans, and then later the French resistance. And that's where Eisenhower was really good. Everybody thought on the British side he was favoring the Americans. Everybody on the American side thought he was favoring the British. It's exactly where he wanted to be. He had to just kind of keep that balance going, very nicely. He had behind him, of course, Mr. Roosevelt and the combined general staff that gave him a lot of credit. And also, one of the strengths of Eisenhower, he was not a warrior per se. He saw a lot of death and horror, but he was not a warrior per se. He was a real expert on logistics. That was one of his early strengths in some of the training that he did. How to move armies, how to feed armies, how to prepare armies, how to get them ready and supply them and keep them on their feet. And to move millions of men around that have all those kinds of needs, as well as the psychological trauma of the things in which they're engaged. Eisenhower had really had great skill in that. The big question is, who is going to command Overlord? Roosevelt couldn't make up his mind. Truman is pressing him. Roosevelt wanted to name Marshall. He kind of owed it to Marshall. Everybody knew if Overlord was successful, and I think they thought it was going to be easy, but it was going to be the terminal battle of the war, of this terrible World War, that whoever emerged as the commanding general was going to be very, very famous. Marshall, however, did not, and this was Marshall, this is pure Marshall, he would not lobby the president for the job. And the president asked him, do you want this job? And Marshall said, that's your decision, not mine. Whatever you want, I will do. That's your decision. He was asked 2 or 3 times. The thing that finally moved it along was Stalin at Casablanca, when the big three were meeting there. They met there, they met in Tehran, and they met at Yalta just before the war ended, and then Potsdam right after the war was over. He was saying, who's going to command it? Who's going to command it? And the Russians, of course, wanted a second front opened on the European mainland as soon as possible. Russians lost millions of folks in the war, millions of folks. Now to Stalin, shoot, just folks, he had with his austerity programs in the 30s, he had tortured people to death and had starved millions to death. Actually, a lot of people don't realize this, although Hitler, for the final solution, never seen before or that way, the worst thing you could ever imagine. More people actually died under Stalin than they did under Hitler from war and from some of the pre-war activities of Stalin. But Stalin was putting the pressure on. Finally, President decided he could not do without Marshall. Marshall, as the advisor, as the great architect, could not be let go. He couldn't bear to think of him being out of Washington. And hence, by default, if you will, Ike gets the command of Overlord and then goes to London to prepare the Overlord, the preparation of Overlord. And the buildup in London was unbelievable. When the order finally comes on the 6th, and you have a picture, you have a picture of Ike talking to the 101st Airborne, who were to be parachuted into Normandy on the night of the 5th. So you got it there? Yep, there's a famous thing. That's the 101st Airborne. They're going to be parachuted that night into Normandy in the rain, but it cleared up by morning. And Eisenhower makes the decision to say that the invasion is on. And the invasion is on. And they go to 4 different beaches. Each of Australians had one, British had one. Omaha Beach, Normandy was where the Americans landed. And once you land, they've got a big German army and a static front right in front of them. But they were not expecting that the landings of the Americans were going to be where they occurred. The shortest place between the British Isles and the European landing is the Pas de Calais, it's called, the Pas de Calais, about 28 miles. That's where the Germans thought they were going to land, and that's where they had prepared the most. They prepared the most in part because General Patton, who was very much feared by the Germans, he was in charge of a complete fake army. It looked like he was putting together a huge army in England, and they had tanks that were actually paper mache models and planes that were paper mache models, and it looked like they were getting ready to move thousands and thousands of troops and everything at the Pas de Calais. So that was a big fake out, and that was a war plan that Eisenhower had overseen, and it did its magic. Once they got set up and got in front of the hedgerows, which took about 3 months after the landing, and started their march across France, liberating of Paris, and moving to the German border, that's when the 3rd U.S. Army under Patton was raised up. And Patton's got the southern tier, and he's just cutting a swath across France and into Germany. And it was clear the war was going to end. It looked like the war was going to end in 1944, perhaps by September. But the Germans weren't giving up. And Hitler probably knew if he lost, he would die. And so it was a last-ditch effort. The two armies that Eisenhower is overseeing, two of the armies, are going north of the Ardennes Forest as they go across France to go into Germany, and then Patton south and one other army south. That was the 12th Army Group, which was headed by Omar Bradley. So Patton reported to Bradley in that configuration. But in the middle was the Ardennes Forest, which was fairly open, lots of trees, but fairly open. Hitler decided this is the Battle of the Bulge, that he was going to put everything that he had left, and they were going to try to exploit the middle of the line, which was not well defended in the Ardennes, and tried to break out all the way to Antwerp and try to reverse the fortunes of the war. And so about the 8th or 9th of December, 1944, what looks like what's called a fading action is reported within a day or two of a major escalation, and that the Germans are throwing everything in to the salient that is in the Ardennes Forest, between the British armies and the American armies. And perhaps Eisenhower's finest moment. When the going got tough, Ike's planning in mind was very adaptive to making change. That's a very important, as you might imagine, very important strength of a commander. And so Eisenhower calls in Bradley, calls in Patton. They reverse Patton. He marches 100 miles in a day and a half. And within 4 days, they relieve Bastogne, which is where everything was kind of congregated. And by the 7th of February, the pocket is built back in. The Germans are pushed back. And now the question is, who gets to Berlin first? And we're at the end of the war. And this still is controversial today. The Russians have 137 divisions, and they're pounding from the east toward Berlin. Eisenhower talks with Stalin, and Stalin said, Ike said, we think it's better that we destroy the army, that we don't go for Berlin, and that we also put troops between Berlin and the Austrian redoubt, where he thought that a lot of the German troops would try to go and then fight guerrilla warfare from that part of Austria. And so Eisenhower gives up the thought of the Americans taking Berlin. Stalin says, well, we're not interested in Berlin either. Right. We're going to stop and stay a little bit south of it. As soon as he said that, he started for Berlin, as soon as he knew that Ike wasn't going for it. And of course, it was the Russians that took Berlin. And where a war ends, can be, in geography, can be a very important thing for the future. And it certainly was in this case. Hitler commits suicide, takes his own life, and the Admiral Dönitz takes Hitler's place as the Fuhrer, and he works out a surrender. They tried to surrender 2 or 3 times, But the United States and Britain and the French resistance, and now de Gaulle has a little bit to say, said, no, there'll be no surrender unless it's unconditional. And we will take the prisoners, and we will hold those senior folks accountable, which they did at Nuremberg for this war effort. Finally, the Germans realized that's their only choice, and they want to get out of the war to get Americans and stop the war before the Berlin is completely cinderized and the people terrorized that were left there. So on the 7th of May, they surrender. We still had fighting to go in the Pacific. Plans are being made now to move people into the Pacific. But of course, we have the atomic bomb. And Ike knew about it, but didn't know much about it. And at Potsdam, Truman, who had taken over, because on the 12th of April, Mr. Roosevelt died of an ischemic stroke, and Truman is president. He's at Potsdam. Churchill had gone to Potsdam for the British, but halfway through, he got voted out of office. And the Labor government comes in, so there's some new players at Potsdam. And Truman gets word that the Alamogordo test was successful, and so Truman gives the word quietly to try to end the Japanese war by dropping one atomic bomb, and two if necessary, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. The pilot in the Hiroshima one is Colonel Paul Tibbets. He was Eisenhower's pilot. He was considered the best pilot in the Air Force. He was Ike's pilot in the early years when Ike's in Europe fighting the war, and had a couple unbelievably close calls just because of his skills. Tibbets is the guy that does that. On that plane, interestingly enough, the navigator was a guy named Dutch Van Kirk, whose son, Tom Van Kirk, a great lawyer in Pittsburgh for years ahead of Buchanan, his dad was a navigator with Tibbets, and he was the longest guy to live. He lived till 1913, Dutch did. Longest guy to live from that plane crew, and it was Compos Mentis to the end. It was a very interesting, there's a lot of interviews they did of him just before he died. He didn't know he was going to die, but just before he died, talking about it. And it's something I recommend to you. You can find him on YouTube. And Dutch Van Kirk. Van Kirk came back after the war, got 2 engineering degrees at Bucknell, and then went to work for DuPont as ultimately their senior engineer. And the DuPont chairman and CEO is a Grove City grad, a great friend of mine. He had not realized that. I had the chance to call him one day and say, "You had a very famous guy working for you." He said, "Really?" Then he looked into it. He said, "You're right." I found out more about that. So the war is over. Eisenhower comes back for accolades. The accolades are those great parades you see. One parade is he's going up Park Avenue. There's a guy up in a building about 10 stories up who's working as a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and he's looking out and he sees Ike going below him, and he's doing war contract terminations. That was Richard Nixon. He was finishing out his tour of duty before he went back to California and ran for Congress. And so Eisenhower now is the most famous person in the world. And like Ulysses S. Grant, he discovers a lot of new friends. They're incredibly wealthy. He will not take any money from them. They offer him all kinds of things. What he will do, they can host him at the great places where they relax and where they golf and where they do things. He'll be their guest, but he won't take any money directly from them. He's very careful about that. And in fact, just before the end of the war, a Hollywood producer had sent someone out to the war thing to tell Ike they wanted to give him a lot of money for his life story. No, he said, no, I'm not in this for the money. I'm in, for what I've been in my career. And he eventually becomes, as we all know, a 5-star general. We had 9 individuals that made 5-star rank. And the reason we went to 5 stars is kind of humorous. Churchill was making Montgomery a field marshal. That would be like a 5-star, and a couple of others field marshals. He wanted to name 2 or 3 of the top Americans field marshals. But Marshall would be Marshall Marshall. This is a true story. And he hated being himself called by his last name, except General Marshall. And so he told Roosevelt, because of that, he wouldn't accept a marshal's baton. He didn't want to be Marshall Marshall. So that's where they came up with the 5-star. Now, once you received a 5-star, and the last 5-star was Omar Bradley, named in 47 after the war, you were paid for the rest of your life. You were on active duty and paid for the rest of your life. Active duty at the call of the president. And you got paid for that. How much? $15,000. How much is that today? It's $214,000. So you got $214,000, and that's the first time Eisenhower made any money. He had no money. So at the end of the war, just before he takes over as chief of staff of the Army, he buys, with his own money, a new Chrysler. And he said to his wife, "That's it, we're out of money. All these years in the Army, and we're broke." Now that was soon to change, because he's now starting to be paid the $215,000 as a 5-star. And they do want to do his memoir, or that he would write about his time at the war. And they work out, George Allen, who was one of his financial advisors, and Cliff Roberts, they work out a deal with Random House, where the way they structure it, he only has to pay capital gains on the money they offer him. Capital gains back in those days, 25%. But the highest marginal income tax rate was close to 90%, if you remember back in those old days. I mean, Elvis wouldn't work for a year or two because he couldn't afford to. You get all this money and he paid 90% of it to the federal government. Other actors were like that too. The tax rate was so confiscatory. But they figured out a legal way for Ike to write his memoirs, and so he got $615,000. That's $5 million he netted after he paid, in today's money, after he paid his capital gain of 25%. And so for the first time in his life, Ike had money. And in 50, he and Mamie buy their first house they ever owned and lived in. They had moved 38 times in 37 years in the Army. And it's at Gettysburg, of course, the farm where it is today. Eisenhower operates as chief of staff for 2 years. It's not a lot of fun. He's not the supreme commander of anything. He's one among many. And although he's Eisenhower, there's no doubt about it, he still has to argue for the money they're going to give to the Army, the Navy, et cetera, and then the process of cutting back. He begins a process that really carried over as president, and that is an analysis that we want to have. Now, I want you to listen to this one, folks. We want to have a balanced budget. We don't want to overspend on the military. Nobody could come into Eisenhower as president and fly a wild military weaponry by him. He knew too much. He understood too much tactically and strategically. Just couldn't do it. And he understood how much that cost. He also understood that we had an advantage with an atomic quasi-monopoly till the Russians exploded their first bomb in 1949. But that monopoly gave us an edge that we didn't need quite as many troops or as many ships. And then he felt very comfortable in that we had a balanced, first of all, deterrence and a balanced force if we needed it. And the ability, he knew this, as we knew from our history, of gearing up quickly if we had to, if we went back to another war. Nobody wanted another war. What were the Russians up to? That made everybody nervous. And after Yalta, they started to take positions that were very, they really created the Cold War, if you will. So Eisenhower is 2 years as Army Chief of Staff. Now what's he going to do? Another one of his friends, who was on the board at Columbia University, said, "We'd love to have you as our president." And he goes to Columbia as the president of Columbia University, one of the great Ivy schools. It was not quite a fit, I would say. He was told one day that Columbia had the greatest physicists, the greatest this, the greatest that. And he said, "Well, are they great Americans?" Well, that was contra, nobody could quite understand that. But that was something that Eisenhower was interested in too. And interestingly, he was Columbia's president, where he got $350,000 as the president in today's money from 1948 to 1953, till the day before he was sworn in as president. Now, during that time, he was in Washington at Truman's request. Remember, he's 5-star. He's there 3 or 4 months helping to set up the Department of Defense. And then Truman got him to be the Supreme Commander, Allied Forces, Europe, and NATO, to be that NATO commander. Well, he's doing that full time. He's still getting paid the $215 as a 5-star, but he's also getting paid by Columbia. He just wasn't there very often. So he kind of used the president's house as a place to stay. And he was sort of in absentia. And when he took the Columbia job, he said, now I don't want to be raising money. I don't want to do an enormous amount of entertaining. I don't want to have to oversee academic details. Now, as an old college president, ladies and gentlemen, that sounded like my job description. You know? I don't know how he avoided all that. But he did raise some money for some things that were necessary, and they kind of tolerated each other. The question is he going to be the president? And I'll do this, and you'll find this interesting. 1947, of course, the vice president, now president because of the death of Roosevelt, is Mr. Truman. Truman came to him and said, Ike, if you'll run as a Democrat, we'll nominate you as president, not me, and I will run for vice president. He said, I don't want to be president. I just don't. He writes a Sherman, sort of a Sherman-esque-like statement that takes him out of it. He didn't think he could win, actually. And so of course, he thought Dewey was going to win. And if Dewey won, he was probably going to be there for 2 terms. And if he's there for 2 terms, then Eisenhower's 66. Way too old to be president. Way too old. He was the oldest president when he left at age 70 who ever served. Holy mackerel, how times have changed, right? So he winds up staying at Columbia, or staying actually in NATO. And they finally bring him back, and he's nominated. And the question is, and I want to do this for a couple minutes, the real question is his relationship with Nixon and how Nixon was chosen. And I've done a lot of Nixon study. He had no idea he was going to be his VP. Herb Brownell, who became his attorney general and had run Dewey's campaign, was his close friend. And he gave to Brownell and another fella the job to pick the VP. Well, they were looking for somebody who was anti-communist, who was young, who geographically balanced the ticket. Ike's from Pennsylvania, but of course California was where Nixon's from. Nixon's the only guy that hit every marker. And so Nixon is nominated at 39 years of age. Eisenhower's in his late 50s. And of course, within a month and a half, we get the Chequers speech, and it came out that in order to make ends meet, that Nixon had set up a fund of friends that had put money into a political fund, didn't go into his pocket, didn't buy a TV or a Vicuna coat or a freezer or anything like that, but it had helped him fly around the country. It helped him politically. But it was more of a political assistant kind of thing than something personal to him. And Nixon made the famous Chequers speech that lets all that information out. Everybody knows. He also announces that, guess what? Stevenson and Sparkman, his VP, also had funds like that. Whoops! And he leaves it up to folks to decide if they want to keep him on the ticket by wiring the National Committee. It's overwhelming. And Eisenhower says, "You're my boy." And Eisenhower waited and waited. This was good. Another skill Eisenhower had. He wanted time to go by. He wanted all the facts to be known, and then more time to go by. There was always a time to make a decision. It was really never to be in a hurry. That's probably what saved Nixon. So Nixon serves as his VP, serves admirably when he has his first heart attack. He had 7 heart attacks in the years that he was, 4 when he was president, 3 after he was out of office. So his heart was failing. He was a heck of a smoker. He smoked 100 cigarettes a day, 4 packs, until he quit cold turkey in 1949, cold turkey. But he had done, presumably some damage to the heart. And of course, it was 20 years later, they had put a new heart in him. LBJ dies at 63. If it had been 10 to 15 years later, they'd have put a new heart in him. But none of those things were available at the time. And so as president, he had a number of things that were really on his mind. A balanced budget, he was very, very careful about that. You could not blow, as I said, a expensive weapons system by him. Where he was deficient, in most people's estimate, was how he looked at the race question. And because of Brown versus the board in 1954, that overthrew Plessy versus Ferguson, that said that putting black students in a separate but equal school was no longer the law of the land, because it was separate, it sure wasn't equal. And there are a lot of other, it was the talisman of Jim Crow, post 1875, 1876. It had gone on for, 3/4 of a century. Eisenhower's view was, that's up to the states. I'm in favor of an integrated army, and he was helpful there, although Truman began it. I'm in favor of an integrated DC. But as far as what's going to go on in states, unless somebody's violating a court order, federal court order, where I have to act and will act, that's really up to the passage of time. And what he wanted was, he wanted more time to go by as hearts got changed and minds got changed and the thinking started to change people's views. But folks who had just gotten this freedom from the court, and then Brown too, which was gave all deliberate speed, had a little more oomph to it, they were ready for some great breakthroughs. And so it's 1957, and Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, gets a federal order to integrate Central High School with nine students who were going there, and he refused. So Eisenhower federalized the National Guard that Faubus had oversight for. The president can do that. Sent in the 101st Airborne Division and had those kids for 2 months escorted into school. So that broke that. Faubus then, as he hoped we would not, Faubus the next year closed the school completely. There is no Central High School. You have to find your own private school. But within a year, Central reopened. And so some of the early things that happened in race relations, Eisenhower was reluctantly, but he did his duty and was brought into. Kennedy was the same way. Kennedy, things got a lot faster, and his brother was, as Attorney General, was much more at the point of the spear in that. But Kennedy had a deal like Eisenhower did with the fellows who were the Southern barons that ran the big committees in the Senate and in the House. And they couldn't get their legislation through. And they had to mollify those folks. And it took Lyndon Johnson squaring some of those guys out and up that made the difference. And so Ike makes it to the end of the presidency. Did not think much of Kennedy. He looked on Kennedy and Nixon as whippersnappers. That is, one was a lieutenant in the Navy, that's Kennedy, when he's the supreme commander, and the other's a lieutenant commander in the Navy. And he had a hard time seeing these gentlemen as having the presence to run the country with the confidence that Eisenhower had. He is surprised that Nixon loses. It's very close, 112,000 votes. Definitely some, I hate to say this now, years later, what we've been through, definitely some questions about what happened in Illinois and what happened in Texas. But Nixon decided not to contest. He didn't think the country was good for the country. And he literally got on a plane and flew down, shook hands with Kennedy, and Kennedy takes office. Kennedy asked Ike what he could do for him. Ike said he had to resign as a 5-star when he was president. Can't be in the military and be president. I'd like the Congress to reinstate me as a 5-star. That was done within 2 weeks. And so till the day he died, Eisenhower was once again a 5-star. I'll close by saying this. As Kennedy said, born in this century, referring to himself, but the fact that Eisenhower was born in the last century, had the experience that he had of the Cold War and the 2 world wars, were essential for this country. In his 8 years, we had no war, we had essentially no inflation, and we had people that were relatively to very prosperous. Every year, 100 historians get together and rank the U.S. presidents. And not surprisingly, the top 4 for the last many, many years have been Lincoln, Washington, the 2 Roosevelts. Sometimes the 2 Roosevelts flip positions. Number 5 recently has been Dwight Eisenhower, number 5. And that's because of what he did as president, the peace that came to this country, and the interstate highway system, which was the greatest undertaking of building of roads by far in the history of this country. And it was built so they could, if they had to, move an army or a tank across the roads. It was under a defense law that helped to procure the money that did what has changed America forever. That's Mr. Any questions? Notes, quotes, or anecdotes? Yes, sir.
Is there any books you could recommend to further our bike education?
Yes. On the war, David Eisenhower, and I had David at Grove City. I had Susan at Grove City too, as speaker. Susan's his granddaughter. Of course, David is Camp David, but he's a historian at Penn, married to Julie Nixon. And David wrote a great book about his uncle at war, Eisenhower at war. And that's a very good one. Stephen Ambrose, I mean, 2 or 3 of the great historians, now all dead except David now, have written good books on Ike. It's not hard to find a bad book on Ike, and it was a very popular fellow to write about. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, everybody. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody.